They were the enemy, an Italian prisoner facing hard labor in the Oklahoma dust, convinced he would lose his life far from home, until the sound of his most intimate local dialect, the forgotten language of his grandmother, was whispered by the American guard standing over him. It wasn't just a language, it was a profound human secret that shattered years of propaganda and changed everything he thought he knew about military conflict and kindness. The train had ceased its grinding shudder hours ago, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a vacuum in the high plains of Oklahoma, 1944. Inside the stifling cattle car, 22-year-old Enzo Rossi clung to a strap, his uniform heavy with the dust of North Africa and the salt of the Atlantic crossing. Captured near Tunis, every memory of his sun-drenched Sicilian village was filtered through the grime on the window. He was one of thousands of Italian prisoners of military conflict, now property of the American forces. For years, the fascist regime had fed them a diet of propaganda. America was a land of cold steel, driven by greed and machines run by barbaric people. He had been told he would be starved or worked to the point of collapse. The air in the boxcar was thin and hot, thick with the smell of unwashed wool and old desperation. The isolation here felt absolute, a truly final exile from Europe. The lack of hatred from his captors was the most unsettling experience. The sudden clang of the steel door being thrown open was deafening. Enzo flinched, bracing for the inevitable shout, the first sign of the savagery he was promised. Instead, sunlight, sharp, white, and unforgiving, flooded the boxcar, revealing a barren landscape under an impossibly wide sky. The air that rushed in was hot and dry, smelling only of sun-scorched grass and the metallic tang of earth. This was not the smoky industrial cage he had imagined. This was a desert. The heat hit him first, searing his lungs and reminding him that his suffering was far from over. Hesitantly, Enzo climbed down, shielding his eyes. Before him lay Camp McAlester, a makeshift city of barbed wire and wood. The guards, in their crisp khaki uniforms, were equally bewildering. They did not shout. They moved with a chilling, disciplined calm, directing the bewildered prisoners with detached efficiency. No malice flickered in their eyes, only cold, bureaucratic detachment. It was the absence of anger that was most unnerving. As he shuffled toward the processing tents, he searched for the promised cruelty. He watched as a guard offered a fellow Italian a cup of water as part of the routine. He looked beyond the fences, seeing only the vast, indifferent prairie. He felt completely lost, unable to grasp what he was seeing. Everything he had been taught about his enemy was falling apart, replaced by an unnerving, impersonal efficiency. His fear intensified when he walked past the watchtower. High above, a guard stood, silhouetted against the blinding sun. As Enzo turned the corner, the wind carried a faint sound, a low rhythmic whistle. It wasn't a command or a warning. It was a simple, old-world melody, a tune that sounded vaguely like something his grandfather might have sung. He dismissed it instantly. But the strange, quiet tune hung in the dry air, a tiny thread of warmth in the suffocating silence of his new prison. The sun, a relentless enemy in the Oklahoma sky, beat down on the work crew with a physical force that made the dust taste like fire. Enzo's work detail was tasked with clearing mesquite brush, a brutal, mindless task that required sweat and silence. Days blurred into a monotonous rhythm of digging and hauling. The only consistent feature of his confinement was the American Guard's unwavering adherence to the rulebook. They were distant, emotionless, and correct in their treatment. Every prisoner received their ample daily calories. It was precisely this detached adherence to the rules that was confusing. This absence of hatred left Enzo adrift, unable to cling to the anger that had sustained him. The monotony was a torment, a slow erosion of spirit more effective than any physical violence could have been. One afternoon, while tearing a stubborn, root-bound shrub from the dry earth, Enzo felt a blinding, tearing pain shoot up his arm. A sliver of jagged root ripped a deep gash across the back of his hand. Blood bloomed instantly, dark and shocking against the pale dust. He gasped, dropping his shovel. A shadow fell over him, It was the guard from the watchtower, a young man with thick, dark hair. The raw, stinging pain in his palm anchored him in the moment. He expected a blow, but the guard moved with surprising tenderness. The guard knelt slowly, setting his rifle down. He looked at the deep wound, then pulled out a clean, packaged bandage. Enzo instinctively pulled back, bracing for a strike, but the guard only held his wrist firmly but gently. Then he spoke. His voice was low, and his words were not the harsh, clipped English Enzo expected. Instead, a phrase fell from the guard's lips, perfect, fluid, and steeped in a melody Enzo had not heard since leaving his mother's kitchen. It wasn't Italian, which would have been shocking enough. It was the rich, almost guttural dialect of Sicilian, the language of his home, of his family. The guard's phrase was simple, intensely personal, and utterly unbelievable. Figliu, stai attento a manutoia, accusi ti ferisci pinenti. Son, watch your hand. Like this, you hurt yourself for nothing. Enzo stared. The world spun. His eyes searched the guard's face for mockery, but the guard, who simply introduced himself as Tony, only focused on wrapping the wound. He was the enemy, standing on foreign soil, yet he had just spoken the secret language of Enzo's heart. Did you know that during the Second World military conflict, America held over 50,000 Italian prisoners of military conflict? The logistical challenge was enormous, but the human stories were even greater. Hit the subscribe button now to see how men like Enzo and Tony broke through the propaganda of military conflict with a simple shared language. Enzo lay awake that night, the memory of the Sicilian words replacing his confusion. He had checked his bandaged hand. The wound was real, the voice authentic. Yet, the possibility that an American soldier could speak the nearly forgotten dialect of his tiny village was unbelievable. It had to be a prank. By morning, Enzo had devised a desperate test, a phrase so local, so deeply rooted in the soil of his island, that no non-native could grasp its meaning. He waited all morning for the guard, Tony, to appear on the perimeter patrol, the suspense of the silence almost unbearable, a knot of pure adrenaline tightening in his chest with every passing minute. Finally, in the mid-afternoon, Tony walked by his section of the fence. Enzo timed his move to coincide with a distant truck. Leaning close to the wire, he whispered his coded question. A beda, ci duna, lumbra, ali picciridi. The beautiful one. Does she give shade to the little ones? The phrase referenced the ancient gnarled olive tree, the oldest in his village, a landmark of his childhood. He threw his entire being into the small, risky verbal challenge. Tony stopped dead. The neutral expression vanished, replaced by a momentary flash of astonishment, followed by a slight smile. He looked directly into Enzo's eyes, and in the same low, perfect Sicilian, replied immediately, Cici la data sempre, e si stanca, ci voli l'acqua di mare per rinfrescare li radici. She has always given it, and if she gets tired, she needs seawater to refresh her roots. The specific, authentic response hit Enzo with devastating certainty. The guard's answer was profound. It not only confirmed the cultural context of the olive tree, but also referenced local folklore known only to those raised on the island's coast. Enzo's knees felt weak. His theory of a calculated psychological operation dissolved instantly. The man before him was not a trick, but a living, breathing connection to his home. Tony gave a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of a shared, secret world. It was the greatest shock of his life, a dizzying moment where geography and military conflict became utterly meaningless. This shared secret, a fragment of language spoken across a barbed-wire fence, was far more effective than any political treatise. Enzo realized with a jolt that the enemy he had feared possessed a human voice, a history, and the same memory of a beloved olive tree that he carried. The shared secret of the olive tree hung in the stifling Oklahoma air, a silent agreement that demanded an explanation. For the next 2 days, Enzo and Tony communicated only in coded glances. Finally, on the third evening, Enzo feigned a need for water and approached the fence. How? Enzo asked in Sicilian. How do you know the language of my home? It is not the language of Rome. It is the language of the rocks and the sea. Tony rested his rifle barrel gently on the ground. It is the language of my nonna, Tony replied. My grandparents sailed from the province of Palermo 80 years ago. They settled in Brooklyn. I was raised on Sicilian stories and Sicilian coffee. It was the only way my nonna would speak to me. Tony's heritage was a painful, beautiful paradox woven into his uniform. He was caught between his American duty and his ancestral loyalty. The revelation hit Enzo with the force of a physical blow. The guard was a man of two worlds, holding American duty and the heritage of his family's migration. The barbed wire suddenly felt less like a prison barrier and more like the vast distance of the Atlantic. Tony explained that when the army shipped him out, he'd felt a strange, split loyalty. His confession revealed the complex, often heartbreaking push and pull of immigrant identity. My family left because there was no future on the island, Tony said. They came here to find land, work, and dignity. When I see you here, I don't see the uniform of an enemy. I see the face of the family they left behind. Enzo felt his own history mirrored in the guard's words. He realized Tony carried an invisible map of ghosts that ran from Sicily directly to this American camp. The history of the soulless Americans was obliterated by this personal truth. Enzo spoke of his beloved Nonna Sofia, who worried over the drought on their small vineyard. Tony listened, nodding, understanding the specific anxiety about the fragile Sicilian earth. That evening, the silhouette of the American guard carrying an Italian immigrant's inherited sadness seemed to embody the profound complexity of the American experience. This quiet dialogue was the first moment of genuine comfort Enzo had felt since his capture. Tony's confession had explained America to Enzo as a nation of endless, colliding origins, a country where the enemy could be the one person who truly understood your home. Tomorrow, the historical forces that created this camp would take center stage, revealing the strange pragmatism that lay beneath this human kindness. Enzo had seen the face of a friend across the barbed wire, but he was still a prisoner, and the camp itself was a marvel of cold, efficient logic that defied everything he had been taught about his enemy. America's sheer industrial might was focused on feeding and controlling over 400,000 Axis prisoners. These were not the dark, brutal dungeons of propaganda. These were sprawling, standardized facilities. The American Army approached this challenge with a calm military order that viewed fairness as a strategic asset. A well-fed, busy, and fairly treated prisoner caused fewer problems. It was an astonishing display of sheer organizational capability. The massive scale of the operation testified to America's industrial confidence, far surpassing the chaos of their European foes. Their sheer wealth made cruelty seem unnecessary and inefficient. The system was designed for control, but accidentally delivered humanity. To Enzo, this practicality looked like a baffling abundance. The food was astonishing. Imagine seeing rows of white bread, mountains of potatoes, and meat every single day, rations that often surpassed what many American civilians were receiving. More importantly, the vastness of the American military conflict machine meant there were simply not enough native hands left to run the domestic economy. Prisoners were viewed as a massive, temporary labor pool. This led to thousands being assigned to work programs on farms and ranches. For farm boys like Enzo, this meant trading the monotony of a barrack for the familiar feel of soil. The reality shattered the propaganda he grew up with. He was shown an order defined by discipline and overwhelming, confusing abundance. He realized his fascist leaders had lied about the fundamental nature of their opponent. It was here, in the cold application of rules, that a tiny crack of hope began to appear. The American system didn't need to humiliate its enemies to prove its power. It simply trusted in its own strength, and in doing so, allowed its captives a measure of human dignity. This was a quiet, unshakable confidence that began the slow internal dismantling of Enzo's entire worldview. The historical facts explained the food and the shelter, but they did not explain the warmth in Tony's voice. The logistics of the camp were clear, but the secret of the shared dialect remained a purely human mystery. The American prisoner camp policy was so generous, it became a quiet but powerful force in shaping post-military conflict relations with Europe. What other surprising kindnesses do you think were shown to the Axis prisoners of military conflict in America? Comment below and let us know. The air in the barracks mess hall was usually thick with the metallic scent of steam. But this evening, a different scent, rich and impossibly familiar, cut through the clamor. Earlier, Tony had approached the fence, passing a small oil-stained paper bag to Enzo. Inside, Enzo found a precious handful of real Italian espresso beans and a few pieces of biscotti his mother had sent. It was a gift that defied military protocol. The aroma alone felt like a message smuggled from Sicily itself. That night, Enzo arranged a small makeshift fire outside the barrack. He gathered a few comrades, but the ritual belonged to him and the memory of his nonna. He ground the beans, filling the Oklahoma evening with the warm, complex aroma of dark roasted coffee. When the bitter black liquid was finally ready, Enzo lifted the small tin cup. It was a sensory bridge, a sacrament of belonging. The careful preparation was a sacred act, reconnecting him to the lost rituals of his own culture. Tony, on a late patrol, paused near the fence line, close enough to smell the smoke and the coffee. Enzo saw him and, with silent understanding, poured a second, smaller portion near the wire. Tony waited, retrieved the cup, and took a slow sip. "Mama sends too much," Tony whispered in Sicilian. "It makes the dust taste better, paisano." The simple taste was a profound reminder of life beyond the barbed wire. They spoke softly over the next hour, sharing the coffee and small, inconsequential memories. They spoke of mothers, the sea, and the profound homesickness that had followed them both. For these few moments, the barbed wire was invisible, replaced by the common ground of family and shared language. For Enzo, the bitterness of the espresso was the taste of mercy. The American Guard had provided not just sustenance, but cultural recognition. Tony's act of defiance demonstrated a courageous human warmth that shattered the image of American coldness completely. This shared coffee was stronger than any barrier, proving that beneath the enemy uniform beat a heart rooted in the very same soil. The shared cup was a silent promise of human connection. Enzo felt a new strength, a realization that if the enemy could be this kind, perhaps the future, even a ruined future, held hope. Tomorrow, the practical consequences of this connection would begin to appear, moving him beyond simple kindness and into a role of unexpected dignity. The shared coffee had forged a silent pact, and within a week, the first concrete sign of Tony's intervention arrived. Enzo was transferred to a small, experimental agricultural detail on the outskirts of the camp perimeter. The objective was to raise specialty produce for the officers' mess. For the first time in months, Enzo was handed a hoe and instructions that involved patience and knowledge. He was asked to tend to rows of budding tomato plants and cultivate patches of basil and oregano. This specialized work demanded not obedience, but Enzo's unique expertise as a farmer. He felt the cool, familiar texture of the soil beneath his aching hands. This was labor, but it was labor with dignity. Back in Sicily, working the vineyard was an act of pride. Here, that feeling slowly returned. Enzo's hands moved with the familiar, precise choreography of a farmer. He was trusted with the care of living things, allowed to use his mind and treated as an expert, not a liability. This steady routine rebuilt his fractured sense of self-worth. Tony would occasionally ride past, slowing down just long enough to shout a quick question in Sicilian about the crop. "Is the basil happy, giardinieri?" he'd ask. This was their new language, the language of work, respect, and mutual contribution. The American camp system had inadvertently provided Enzo with a powerful sense of self-worth. He realized that the greatest terror of his captivity was the psychological erasure of his identity. His fear was slowly replaced by a profound pride, a quiet joy in seeing the crops flourish. He had been promised chains, but instead he was given tools and responsibility. This was a profound daily lesson in the difference between tyranny and confidence. As the sun set, Enzo felt a therapeutic calm settle over him. He was a prisoner, yes, but he was also a gardener, tending to life on a foreign shore. The pungent, sweet aroma of the basil rising from the patch was a constant, defiant whisper of Italy carried on the Oklahoma wind. That small act of growth provided a quiet strength, preparing Enzo for the next equally surprising cultural shock: the bewildering sounds of American music that would soon bridge the final gap between enemy and friend. The evenings at Camp McAlester were quiet, broken only by the chirping of crickets. But one Saturday night, the atmosphere in the mess hall changed when a guard brought in a battered, tinny radio. The sound that spilled out was a fast, brassy swirl of swing music. The tinny sound of the radio speaker vibrating against the wooden table was a constant sensory reminder of the foreign world he now occupied. The chaotic energy of the jazz felt wild and incomprehensible compared to the strict music of the Axis powers. The music was loud, unrestrained, and aggressively hopeful. Tony noticed Enzo's confusion and motioned him over. "Ascolta. Listen," he murmured in Sicilian. Then the song changed. The tempo slowed, and a velvet voice, rich with melancholy and yearning, began to sing. "Who is that?" Enzo whispered. "That," Tony said, a proud smile touching his lips, "is Frank Sinatra. He is nostro, one of ours. Italian, but American." Tony's eyes shone with the complicated pride of the immigrant. Tony explained that Sinatra was the sound of the Italian-American experience, a voice that carried the old world's passion into the new world's promise. He spoke of the duality in Sinatra's music. As the music played, Enzo spoke of his deepest worry: the future of his family's vineyard. Tony listened, then offered a simple, profound piece of advice. "The earth can be healed," he said, "but the language you speak with me, that is the seed you must keep. It means you will never be truly lost. You always have a language here. You'll always have a place." Tony's tone was utterly sincere, a brother giving counsel, not a guard issuing orders. Tony's words confirmed that the connection was a permanent human lifeline that tied directly to Enzo's personal hope for survival. When the song ended, Enzo walked back to his bunk. The great American sound had delivered the final heartwarming truth. Even in captivity, he had found a brother. The spring air of 1945 was heavy with the scent of blossoming alfalfa and the electric tension of history holding its breath. All across the vast network of American prisoner camps, rumors of Europe's collapse began to outrun the official communiques. One quiet afternoon, while Enzo was tending his basil, the camp's air horn blared. The commander gathered the prisoners and delivered the news: Germany had surrendered. The military conflict in Europe was over. The sudden declaration stole the breath from every man who stood on the dusty parade ground. The news hit like a sudden, unexpected silence after years of thunder. The end felt surreal, extinguishing both fear and defined purpose. The Italian prisoners were met with a wave of stunned, complicated silence. Enzo stood frozen, his mind blank. The memory of his Nana's vineyard fighting against the image of rubble he knew must be the reality. In the days that followed, officers began processing the men for repatriation. Enzo packed his few belongings: American-issued clothes, the clean linen bandage Tony had given him, and the smooth stone for grinding coffee. As Enzo waited at the final exit gate, Tony approached, his face unreadable. He was no longer Enzo's guard. "So, you go home, Paisano," Tony said. Enzo nodded, his throat tight. "I go back to the ruins." Tony reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. On it was written an address in Brooklyn and a short note. "If you ever come to America, look for my family. They always keep the coffee hot. Your brother, Tony." It was the greatest wealth Enzo had ever received, a ticket to a home he hadn't known existed. Enzo took the paper, folding it carefully into the pocket over his heart. They exchanged a firm, unsentimental handshake, a silent, solemn promise. As Enzo climbed into the back of the transport truck, he looked back at the fence line. Tony stood watching. The silence was complete, but the message was clear. Enzo was leaving America, but the lesson, the unexpected gift of friendship, was coming home with him. The truck rumbled to life. Enzo gripped the paper in his pocket, realizing that he was taking with him a future built on the quiet promise of hope for a ruined world. The journey home was long and slow, finally depositing Enzo back onto the ravaged shores of Italy in the cold, unforgiving winter of 1946. He stood on the docks of Naples, ready to face the ruins and cling to the hope he carried. The sight of his homeland was a brutal shock. Cities were flattened, and the familiar warmth of Italian life was buried under rubble. The air tasted of wet ash and desperation, a grim reality far removed from the Oklahoma sun. His heart ached for the beautiful, fragile world he had left behind. Yet, despite the material ruin, Enzo carried something the bombs could not touch: a profound resilience and the paper with Tony's Brooklyn address. He returned to his village to find his family's vineyard still standing. He began the slow process of rebuilding. His efficiency, modeled after Camp McAlester, set him apart. He quickly restored the vineyard and secured a contract to supply produce to the Allied occupation forces. His success became the consequence of American fairness. He knew the only way forward was through hard, honest work. In the early 1950s, Enzo opened a small trattoria. It became known for its optimism. Enzo told everyone the unbelievable story of the American guard who spoke perfect Sicilian. He spoke of the dignity of the work he was given and the moment his enemy shared coffee with him. His cafe became an unofficial center for reconciliation. Allied officers often visited. Enzo would show them the faded paper, a testament that the military conflict was defined by the small kindnesses of individual men. "They taught me that freedom," he would say, "is not given by treaties but by people." Enzo never used the address. He kept it pristine, a symbol of hope. His deepest commitment became passing on the moral lesson he had learned. He mentored young boys, teaching them to work with pride and calm determination. He showed them that true strength wasn't about dominating, but about having the moral confidence to treat everyone with respect. This was the philosophy Tony had unknowingly imparted. By the time Enzo Rossi passed away decades later, his cafe stood as a landmark, his story a quiet legend. He had returned from the military conflict not with bitterness, but with a seed of human understanding. The unexpected kindness shown on a dusty farm in Oklahoma had become the quiet, profound foundation for his entire life. If this forgotten chapter of history and the power of human connection moved you, hit the like button to help this story reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another unbelievable true story from the past.